Imagine for a moment that you are an 18th century opera composer. You've just been hired to create a new setting of the immensely popular libretto L'Olimpiade, with a text by Pietro Metastasio. Like so many others who have tried their hand at this text, including your mentors, peers, and rivals, you're confronted midway through the second act by perhaps the most provocatively tragic moment in the entire opera: the catastrophic separation of the central pair of lovers, Megacle and Aristea, a scene that culminates in the aria Se cerca, se dice. So let's think through a practical problem that any composer faces when setting this text. What music do you write for the words rispondi, mori? Well, maybe it feels strange to even jump in at this point. After all, we haven't even decided on a key, a tempo, or a musical affect. But what I do hope that we can see is that this line concludes a stanza of poetry, and as such, it makes sense to match it to a gesture of musical conclusion, a cadence. But what kind of cadential figuration will work best for us? Well, there's a seemingly infinite number of options. Why not something like this? Or maybe something like this. But what if I were to tell you that the sense of freedom here was in fact an illusion? That from an 18th century perspective, there's really only one way of setting this text. So let's hear the musical responses of actual 18th century musicians. I'll play for you now 7 settings of this text, each one of them representing roughly a decade in the history of this enormously popular Metastasian aria.
Rispondi, mori. Rispondi, mori. Rispondi, mori. Rispondi, mori. Rispondi,
As these excerpts make clear, an 18th century maestro di cappella had a rather specific answer to our initial question. Each composer set Rispondi Mori as a leaping 2-5-1 melody set against 4-5-1 in the bass, forming a highly stereotyped musical action, or schema, that I call the Mori cadence. The Mori cadence indexes Se cerca se dice much like the eponymous chord from Wagner's Tristan und Isolde. But whereas the Tristan chord plays out within a cohesive operatic experience shaped by a single compositional voice, the significance of the Mori cadence has to do with the chronologically disparate musical activities it unites, its consistent association with a specific text across nearly 70 years of operatic history. It didn't matter whether you flourished in 1730 or 1790, nor whether you addressed audiences in Rome or Berlin. No matter the circumstance, you said Rispondi Mori the same way. The musical activity we have just heard offers a very small glimpse into an astoundingly rich musical tradition. This glimpse is small in at least 2 respects. First, it is small because these 7 excerpts reflect only a fraction of the staggering number of compositional responses to Metastasio's text that flourished throughout the century. We have evidence for at least 80 different settings of Se cerca se dice, composed by 50 composers and performed on the stages of 86 theaters across Europe. And of these, the music of approximately 70 settings have survived to this day. And second, it is small because the Mori cadence is but a local element within a much larger musical pattern, one that offers Se cerca specific solutions for nearly every conceivable compositional decision. Se cerca, that is, occupies a special sound world populated by specific kinds of musical actions. In today's talk, we are going to explore that sound world and the ways composers moved within it. So borrowing a term from cognitive science, as well as musical schema theorists, I regard the musical conventions of the cerca tradition as a script, which is essentially a cognitive schema for what typically happens in routinely experienced events like eating at a restaurant or going to the airport. The cerca script, as I call it, can similarly be understood as simply what tends to happen in a setting of cerca sedice. It consists of compositional routines both large and small in scale, ranging from surface gestures like our mori cadence to characteristic phrase types, tonal paths, and repetition schemes at higher structural levels. In my brief time today, I'd like to provide an introductory sketch of the cerca script by first outlining the aria's large-scale organization, and then focusing on the detailed event sequence associated with the first stanza. We'll then conclude with an analysis of one particular opening stanza setting that will allow us to get a sense of how composers could use these conventions to read the singing character of Megaclé in unique ways. With these brief windows into the cerca tradition, I hope to sensitize you to some of the aria's rhetorical trappings, while at the same time encouraging nuanced hearings and engaged interpretations of the tradition's many extraordinary musical products. So let's begin our sketch in familiar territory. I imagine most of us are quite well versed in that ubiquitous musical script that we call sonata form, so we can quickly get a sense of the broad outlines of a typical cerca setting using sonata labels. The on-screen annotations show how the aria's first two stanzas resemble a two-part sonata exposition. But this block of sonata-like material is followed by something different. A fast tempo setting of the final stanza, which we lack a useful sonata label for. Instead, I refer to this space as the cabaletta, borrowing a term for similar spaces that are ubiquitous in 19th century arias. These action spaces are typically distributed into two rotations. A first, consisting of an exposition and dominant cabaletta, followed by a second, featuring a recapitulation and tonic cabaletta. Now, I've focused on this structure because it's the most common large-scale form in the tradition, but it's not the only one. If you'd like to read a little bit more about some of the other formal possibilities, you can pause the video right now. There are further distinguishing features at these higher levels of musical structure. For instance, cerca settings are typically in E-flat major and consistently begin directly with singing. No cerca setting ever has an opening ritornello. Some of these features draw expressive meaning from broader generic norms. Opening ritornellos, for example, are often omitted in arias like cerca that are addressed as acts of speech to another character listening on the stage, something Paul Sherrill has noted in his dissertation on the da capo aria. Moreover, the aria's action spaces are often filled by very specific kinds of music. To take one example, the cabaletta launches with a characteristic sentence type, which begins with an antiphonal exchange of forte orchestral flourishes and declamatory vocal gestures, forming what I call an apotheosis presentation, followed by a continuation module that produces a half cadence marked by a forceful orchestral tutti. Here are two examples of this characteristic cabaletta opener. Thus, we see that the aria's global structure and sectional layout is just as highly stereotyped as its gestural surface. At every level, cerca is shot through with conventions. To get a sense for just how detailed the script's sectional requirements can be, I turn now to the specialized sequence of musical events that accompanies the aria's opening stanza. On screen, we can see a schematic model of the first stanza, detailing the scripted musical events that make up this action space. This schematic will guide our discussion in this section, as will a model example of the stanza composed by Pasquale and Fossi that we will refer to frequently. The opening stanza unfolds as a quasi-period structure, anchored to the text question and answer rhetoric. Megaclé first imagines his beloved asking where he has gone, producing an antecedent-like phrase ending with a half cadence. And then he imagines his friend Lichida telling her that he has died in a consequent-like phrase that ends with a mori cadence. We will begin our investigation by exploring a special extension of the by now familiar mori cadence. We can see this extension in our model setting by Infossi, where the characteristic melodic rest that divides rispondi from mori is drawn out by an orchestral interlude. These common parenthetical insertions, another example of which is shown above, stage moments of halting contemplation as Megaclé comes to grips with the full weight of his words. Already then, we see that composers had several options for staging this moment in the cerca script. Does Megaclé heave out his impending death quickly and breathlessly, or does he linger, perhaps to gather strength or ponder his actions? Dove, at the end of the second line, is typically set to one of several question formulas, the most common of which is a rising fi-sol cadence that I dub the Dove half cadence. This question formula has several variants and diminutions, often employing features like high do drops or rising lines that move mi, fi, sol. And Fosse, for instance, employs the topmost variant of the schema in his setting, which sounds like this. We can think of these as the unmarked default ways of setting the line to question, but composers could also employ marked half-cadence types to achieve special rhetorical effects. Hasse, for instance, imports a 1-7-2 escape tone gesture from recitative, what Paul Sherrill and Matthew Boyle call the Frage schema. Let us hear this schema first as Hasse employs it in an Act 1 monologue for Megaclé, and then as he uses it in Se cerca se dice. By importing a recitative schema, Hasse highlights line 2's status as imagined speech. The schema seems to enclose Dove in musical quotation marks, marking it off as performed speech within a prevailing songful, albeit highly declamatory, environment. By understanding how these two lines are typically set, we become alert to special, se cerca-specific musical strategies crafted through their manipulation. For instance, in his 1766 setting, Antonio Sacchini sets the opening stanza not as a closed period, but as what James Webster calls an anteperiod, or what we might, from the perspective of sonata form, describe as PNTR, concluding with a medial caesura. Sacchini's use of an uncharacteristic formal script for the opening stanza causes the mori cadence to fire early in conjunction with Dove, the wrong text. In other words, while this is an unmarked sonata opening, it is a deformational se cerca launch that jumbles the aria's typical text-music correspondences. Sacchini responds to the pressure of this deformation in the recapitulation, where he excises the second line altogether and thereby reunites the mori cadence with its proper text. The sense of semantic rightness achieved here relies on se cerca-specific knowledge, not on any broader generic, formal, or stylistic frameworks. And hence, This aria seems to be addressed to cerca connoisseurs in Sacchini's Milanese audience, whose sufficient knowledge of the aria script would allow them to recognize and appreciate Sacchini's deformations. While lines 2 and 4 are tightly scripted events oriented towards specific cadences, lines 1 and 3 are more loosely defined by broad rhetorical functions. For instance, line 1 has the function of producing the phrase's opening gambit, of setting up the cerca sound world. Here, composers responded to the paired clauses of Metastasio's text with a two-part musical gesture that descends from sol to mi, and which is distributed across the rhythmic pattern shown in our schematic model. This produces an opening gambit like the one we just heard from Sacchini, which is likewise similar to Anfossi's opening, which I will play now. Whereas line 1 establishes tonic with a distinctive opening gambit, line 3 works to regain the tonic following the dove half cadence. Most settings, as we just heard from Anfossi, navigate this juncture with ease by simply beginning line 3 directly on tonic. But in other settings, dominant harmony extends well into the stanza's second half, and this frames tonic return as a contingent goal worked out over the back half of the phrase. Still other settings lose their grip on tonic altogether, drifting off to cadence in some other key, something that would be virtually unthinkable in a sonata-form piece space. These problematized or abandoned tonal returns reveal a common narrative paradigm for opening cerca phrases, one in which the opening lines are performed effortlessly, while the closing lines navigate and address significant obstacles to tonal security. In Andreozzi and Cimarosa's hands, Mechiclé shows no difficulty proposing the aria's central question, but he struggles to articulate an appropriate response. An especially tragic performance of this narrative can be found in Josef Mysliveček's setting from 1778. This aria launches with that most characteristic galant opening gambit, the Meyer schema, which sets the first pass through lines 1 and 2. But upon repeating line 2, Mechiclé is struck dumb by a dove half cadence, which grinds to a halt on a pronounced fermata, staged as a sudden and violent rejection of the opening melodic action. What follows is a tragic drift into the key of the minor dominant, extinguishing any hope of tonic recovery. After an uncharacteristic and expressively potent latido cadence, a ghostly echo of the opening orchestral texture returns in bare octave, perhaps gesturing toward the customary line 4 orchestral interjection, which leads to an equally fragmented mori cadence distilled to its concluding 5-1 leap. In this setting, quite unlike the others we have seen, Mechiclé's initially confident sentimentality evaporates in a flash, leaving behind a scarred psychological landscape from which he may never recover. This is a distinctive narrative arc forged out of latent expressive possibilities in the cerca script, offered as a brief illustration of the hermeneutic readings that we make possible by investigating aria-specific scripts. Myslivacek and Fossi, Sacchini, and others make their megaclays do different things with Metastasio's text, in spite of some extraordinarily consistent musical behaviors. And we have but scratched the surface of the tradition, focusing almost entirely on the aria's opening phrase. Where do each of these megaclays go from here? What is the next musical step of their simultaneously shared and distinctive journeys? If you'd like to see, I invite you to read my dissertation, which will be available by the end of this year at the link shown above, as well as in the video's description. At the close of Music in the Galant style, Robert Yergin expresses the need for detailed archaeologies of specific 18th century genres, writing that the art of 18th century court music extended beyond knowing all the schemata. One needed experience in writing fugues, setting liturgical or operatic texts, and constructing an appropriate sequence of schemata for any occasion and musical genre. This paper steps in at precisely this gap, exploring what a composer needed to know to operate in a very narrow situation. The situation of setting se cerca, se dice. And this kind of knowledge is not often the focus of music theorists. Schenkerians, transformational theorists, and even schema theorists often center general musical knowledge within their lines of inquiry. Knowledge that transfers from one situation to another, or that unites the working habits of all composers living within a shared tonal idiom. And this makes a good deal of sense. Why spend a lot of theoretical energy erecting technology that's not going to tell you about a lot of diverse practices? But even though the se cerca script is undoubtedly more limited in its application compared with, say, sonata form, it is also incomparably richer and no less essential to the working knowledge of an opera composer living in the 1760s. The se cerca script allows us to catch a glimpse of an enshadowed world of situation-specific pressures animating the galant style unseen, molding its materials into concrete shapes alive with detail. And by studying scripts of this sort, we begin to cast light upon this world, building in turn a sharper picture of the rich ways the human musical experience is textured by the delicate interplay of general and specific knowledge. Thank you.